Clearly, I was an example of it, but I didn't see that in anyone else. And even being brown in other spaces didn't exist for me. It was predominantly white, and I didn't realize, I wasn't conscious of it at the time. You know, I thought this was just the reality. There weren't that many out there, but I was okay with it, and at that time, or at least I thought I was okay with it. So one day, I stumbled upon a YouTube video. I don't know if anyone has seen Brown Like Me. Show of hands, no, maybe. Vijay was in it, so if you want to see Vijay a couple years ago, you should check it out. It's quite an interesting film. And when I found that video, it was really interesting. So it was put out by ASAP. I had no idea that in a couple of years later I'd be working for ASAP. So it was an interesting, it was just interesting. And so it talked about narratives of South Asians who were gay, both male and female, talking about their own coming up processes and growing up in Canadian society, which was predominantly white, and not having that association there, not having that community, not having that base to relate to. And so I found that very, very empowering, and it kind of sparked a series of events that I'm not going to get into because I'm not even personally aware that that's him. But that kind of led me to see that, you know, there was this gap that I wasn't addressing, and I kind of settled for whatever I was given, and being in that space, being the only brown guy there in a lot of spaces is what my reality was at the time, but it's entirely changed right now. So back to my role at ASAP. So I deal with two different communities, and I say different even though they're kind of clumped together. So I deal with mainstream South Asian populations, and I deal with the Tamil community in specific. But I deal with what's known as MSM. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term MSM, but it's an epidemiological term, I said it without a flinch, for men who have sex with men. So now this doesn't exclusively talk about gay men, because when you think of men having sex with men, everyone says gay. Gay is like the only result of what that is, maybe bi. The reason why we use this term and we don't just say gay is because it is very inclusive of other terms. So whether you're gay, bi, queer, or even straight, just as long as the individual identifies as a man who has sex with other men. It might not be all the time, it might be sometimes, but this is a way that we were able to catch all those populations. Why this is important is going to tie into a part I'm getting into later on around shame, but for now, just take that as it is. So the outreach strategy at ASAP is very interesting. So we enter a lot of different spaces, so we don't just go, a lot of my work focuses, a majority of my work focuses on dealing with these MSM populations. And so we don't just go into queer or LGBT spaces to do outreach and work. We go into a lot of mainstream South Asian spaces, whether it be, and Tamil spaces rather, so Kondatam, Masalam and Dimesti, all these events that happen in the city throughout the year that are predominantly mainstream, and you don't necessarily see a highlighted queer presence at. And so, an example of what we'd be doing is, let's say it was Kondatam, and this is an example of a colleague who told me of, and she was tabling at this event. She had a booth set up with our information on it, a banner, pamphlets, and we have these little condom packages that are these little squares. And so on the outside they're black, now they're purple, but you can't tell what's inside. And so, but inside there's a condom and a lube package. So it's promoting the whole safer sex bit. And so people love taking them sometimes, well, because it's free and they don't know what's inside. And so that's kind of why we have them in package, so we don't just have condoms sitting out there. And so you'll have a lot of people taking these things, and many instances they'll take them, and especially kids will take them while their parents are standing there. So there isn't any issue with it. And some will open them right away, and we'll just drop it on the table right there, and like they had touched something that's like infectious in some way, and like they cut themselves on glass, or like they just drop it with so much fear. Some will gasp, some will just give us dirty looks, some will tell their children, no, don't touch that, we need to leave. And sometimes people yell. And so in this one instance, it wasn't me being there, people don't like yelling at me. Yeah, they do sometimes. But this girl, my colleague, was at this table, and this gentleman was actually getting into a heated debate with her. And luckily at that time, she had somebody like people were supporting her, community members around her came up and said something. But that isn't always the case. There isn't always that room for dialogue or support. It was a good example, it was a highlighted example, but she was actually getting yelled at in this debate for having condoms at an event. being inappropriate. So that's just to give you a snapshot of like the status of shame, talking about sex. But yes, so going to outreaches, we do get a lot of looks, a lot of, especially when people read and we have like an image of, not an image, but information about STIs and what that means, talking about oral sex, anal sex, vaginal sex, whatever it may be. And when they read that, they just completely get this look of disturbance on their face. Like, why are we here? What are we doing? This is an inappropriate conversation to be having, almost as if we were encouraging sex in general. As if, you know, if we weren't giving out condoms, that sex wouldn't happen. So we're giving out condoms, we're encouraging sex to happen, is the message they're getting across. As opposed to, if we didn't have the condoms, their sex wouldn't be happening, you know, which is in itself interesting. And so the outreach strategy is to go, we go into those spaces, we go to have those confrontations, to challenge that stigma, to challenge that discrimination, to challenge that fear people have. Now, it's not always people getting scared of us. Sometimes, and this is a very common thing, people will see the information and, you know, maybe remember the website, which is asap.ca if anyone wants to know, and it's ASAAP, not ASSP, so ASAAP. And we'll call the office, and it'll be an anonymous phone call. They might get nervous and hang up right away, or they might call again. We might recognize their voice, we might not. It's a small office, so we're usually on that. And ask us about a service, whether it be Snathan, whether it be Dosti, whether it be support around questions about your sexuality, about your sexual health. And so a lot of the communication that we have when we go to outreaches in those spaces happens after, because people are very scared to come up to us and ask those questions. And the other interesting piece about outreaching is that if we decide to leave the table for 5 minutes and we come back, we get rid of, let's say, the 50 condoms on the table, all 50 are gone. As opposed to we're standing for an hour, maybe, you know, 10 will leave the table or 5. But as soon as we disappear and people think no one's looking, they will come and just take them. It's not like one person taking the entire bunch. We can stand off to the side and we'll see people will just keep coming and grabbing the free stuff, and they won't put it back on the table. So it has a lot to do with if they're being seen and what that means. Because if they're seen doing this, it means something else if they're not seen. If they're doing this in the hiding, if they're doing this and being invisible about it, which ties into another thing. So sex. I know I'm going to mention a lot, so here it is. Most people have it at some point in their lives, some regularly. Some like to think those are the lucky ones, and some purely for procreation. But for the most part, many of us are products of it. And I say that to be inclusive of people who are born in vitro, you know, it happens now, so it's cool. But discussions around it rarely happen, if at all, and if we see them. And I'm going to put this out there that, you know, this is my perspective on this. So if you are lucky enough to be having these conversations, you know, with friends and socially, then that's amazing. I don't personally see it, and nor that I want to have these conversations with, you know, my mother or my father or my sisters, you know, any of that, and I don't know if anyone wants to have those conversations. But socially, it happens very rarely, especially within the Tamil community and South Asian community in general. And so we see it as very negative, as taboo is wrong a lot of the time, or we fear it. It's a very hard topic to talk about. You know, I work in sexuality and sexual health, but if my sister wants to talk to me about something about this, I even cringe at that, right? And it shouldn't be the reaction, but that's what it is, right? And sometimes these discussions do happen, but there isn't control over the dialogue. So it might be, you know, a new bride and the elders, the women are talking to her about, you know, the wedding night and what that means with this intent of, like, you know, popping out children. And there might be that conversation happening. I don't know because I wasn't in that conversation, but somebody told me to mention that. So I better go with that and mention that. And so I put that out there because, you know, these conversations could happen. And, you know, a bunch of straight guys might be talking about, you know, who they hooked up with. And that might be something that they want to brag about. But that's a closed thing. That it doesn't say, oh, did you use protection? Or, you know, are you getting tested after? None of those other discussions are happening, right? So it's very quick, it's very narrow, and it's very limited. So what happens to the activity that we don't talk about? Does it just stop? Clearly not. You know, I mentioned that before with the whole condom analogy. And instead, these forbidden activities still occur, but without proper education around it. People are afraid to ask the questions around their individual health and how it's affected, and how to protect themselves. It's not for a lack of resources out there, because I'm telling you, condoms, yes, they're expensive, but we have free condoms coming out of everywhere. Like, universities give it out, agencies give it out, Toronto Public Health gives it out. It's not that we don't have these resources, it's around the idea of shame, the rumors that are come up with that. So if we're accessing this, are we accessing it in a way that people are going to see us, acknowledge us? Sometimes I'll get a call saying, hey, is it possible to get condoms? And a person will say they want to access it, they know we have it for free, they can get it from us. Can you put it in an envelope and then put it into a plastic bag and then leave it in the front entrance and I'll come pick it up at a certain time? And this is not an uncommon thing. This happens, I've heard this story with a lot of other agencies dealing with ethno-specific groups. And so this is not just isolated. They don't even want to be seen coming into our space. Now luckily, our office is in an office building where there's law offices and travel agencies and stuff like that, but it's very closed off. There isn't any, you can't just see it when you walk in from the street. You have to go upstairs, it's fairly hidden, so anonymity is there. And confidentiality is something that's really important to that and to all the work we do, because a lot of what we do and the people we deal with aren't out to their peers, aren't out to their families, or about their sexuality or their sexual health. So let's say they're HIV positive and they're not communicating that to people that they know in their lives for fear of discrimination. We have to keep that in confidentiality. We have to maintain that with everything we do. So I can't talk about a person who's in Snathan and has come to meetings and told me this great story. I can't talk about that outside of here, especially with associating their identity to it. Sexuality and stigma. So sex itself is already so stigmatized, and it's not in a category of suitable topics, but when we're talking about sexuality, or same-sex relationships, same-sex sex, whatever, it usually elicits a stronger response. So all these negative stereotypes that you're going to think of come to mind. And I'm not saying everyone has that, but a lot of people do have that. And even if they don't, like me, even when I was coming out, realizing the fact that, there's a potential that, somebody I come out to could feel those ways, can feel those negative feelings towards me, even though I don't know, because they haven't come out to say that, they're okay with people being gay, because you don't just go around saying, oh yeah, I'm okay with, gays, they're really cool, blah, 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 blah. That fear of even the individual coming out is there, that, the family, the friends that they might tell, might react negatively, and where does that put them? Especially if they're in a precarious situation where they don't have the finances or the luxury to, get out of their situations. And so, we get sick, we get dysfunctional, mentally ill, we get perverted, we get, we don't get that way, we get those as stereotypes, projections towards us. And then people think that we're in love with every straight person that we meet. They think it's contagious. These are all things that are common. They think we all wear pink. I love pink, but that's not a thing that's just associated. They think we all fall under this specific category. I was doing a workshop in Jane and Finch earlier in the summer with a group which was predominantly Tamil women, and there were some women that were in Tamil. I believe they were new from the Caribbean, and when we asked the Tamil women what were the negative aspects that they heard about, like gays, like what do you think? And I want the negative to come out, because I want people to talk about that, to address it, because we don't talk about it, we don't acknowledge it, and it becomes invisible. When things become invisible, they become implicit, and then it just keeps going. But when I asked them, they were all really shy to even talk about that. They won't say it straight up. Some of the women from the other communities were okay with talking about that. And so they mentioned, wearing really tight clothes, dancing around, they're sick, whatever. But the Tamil women, they came up with some, but not as many as other communities, because they don't want to talk about that. And it's the same thing applies to when you're talking about sex. You don't want to talk about it. It becomes this thing that's invisible. But things that exist that you treat as invisible don't go away, right? They still exist. You're just pushing them into another margin. Stereotypes. So when we're talking about MSM, I want to just touch on this once again, because MSM is a category we use because a lot of people identify as straight. They don't want to identify as being gay, bi, even if that's what their actions are, or pansexual, if you want to throw that out there, because it means that they are lesser than, or it means that they're going to be labeled as all those stereotypes that come to mind. So I had this conversation with my mother. She was saying that, if you're going to do a speech about something, don't just start off with saying you're gay, or don't just start off with saying that, because then that's all people see you for. And so we have this ingrained in our minds that we need to prove ourselves to be, the best of what we do, and then come out. And why does that have to happen? Why do we need to do, it's great for everyone to achieve this certain status and, fight for being the best at what they do and whatever they're passionate at, but why do we need to prove ourselves as individuals first and then talk about orientation? Because people, when they hear your orientation, automatically all those stereotypes come to mind. I've had friends that I knew my whole life, and when I decided to come out, you know, those stereotypes came up, and they automatically assume that I'm going to be good at fashion, that I'm going to be good at cooking, I'm going to be good at this, that, and the other, and it becomes this why are all these things associated? Yes, I might be good at all those things, but I was the same. I was great at it before that I am right now. You know, like it's not like that something has changed, but you've known my take on all these things for such a long time. Why has that changed? And that fear comes out when you're in different workspaces. I luckily enough work in a space where I can be open about my sexuality. I can also be open about my cultural identity. Growing up, I wasn't able to have that openness about my cultural identity. People automatically assumed I was Indian. And the word Tamil didn't exist to most of the kids I knew growing up. Again, I grew up in a very white neighborhood of the city. And so when that happened, it was like, okay, I continuously got used to just being, oh yeah, my name's Ram. Not Ram, not Ram Raj, Ram, because it was the easiest way for people to associate with me. I still, to this day, if I meet someone who's brown, now I'm used to saying Ram or Ram Raj, but if I meet someone who's white, I'll automatically say Ram. And if some of my friends who know me as Ram see me, they laugh. And I don't do this on purpose, it just happens instinctually. Hiding parts of your identity for who you are. That same thing applies to your orientation. If you're going to have to make this assumption that, you know, everyone is straight, or if you're gay, something's going to be indicative of it, you're going to constantly be on the defensive about like being masculine, being hyper-masculine, not drawing any femininity, scared of wearing pink, almost being homophobic in some situations, and in a lot of situations, people being homophobic. And that ties into a lot of the identities that I'm seeing with a lot of the clients. So I'm not just saying this like talking about myself, but because a lot of people have these examples, and it comes out in these support spaces of acting like, oh, you know, well, they're too gay. Why do they have to act that way? Well, you know, they can act however they want. It should be irrelevant. It shouldn't affect the way you are. It shouldn't affect the way anyone else sees them. That's just who they are. I might be going on tangents, so you know, bring it home if I have. Okay, so the last piece I wanted to touch on is the support spaces, which I find to be the most important spaces when you're talking about the MSM community. I'm not going to say MSM. I will say gay now for the sake of it. I've already explained what it means, so we're just going to say gay. The gay support space.